The first mistake was accepting the invitation. When my grandfather's personal assistant called, I should have known something was off. Grandpa never invited people to his estate, not unless he wanted something, and usually that something wasn't good. But when I arrived, I realized the real reason he had asked me to visit. Her, the caretaker. Her name was Elena. She was young, far too young to be working for a man like my grandfather. But there she was, moving through the grand halls of the estate with quiet confidence, her soft brown eyes watching everything, missing nothing. I noticed her immediately. And the worst part? She noticed me too. The estate was as massive as I remembered. An old-world mansion surrounded by endless fields, thick forests, and staff that moved like ghosts, silent and obedient. Grandpa had never been an easy man. He was rich, powerful, and controlling. The kind of man who believed everything had a price, including loyalty. So, why had he brought me here? Why now? I found out at dinner. We sat at a long mahogany table, just the two of us. The dining hall was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of silverware against porcelain. Elena stood nearby, pouring my wine, her fingers brushing mine for just a second too long. I glanced up, and she smiled. Something inside me shifted. Grandpa cleared his throat. "How long are you staying?" I forced a casual shrug. "Couple of days, maybe." He smirked. "Good. It's about time you learned how this place works." That was the second mistake. I should have left that night. But I didn't. Because when I caught Elena looking at me from across the room, her lips curling into something dangerous, I knew she was a mistake I wanted to make. I should have left. Every instinct told me to pack my bags and go. But then there was her. Elena moved through my grandfather's estate like she belonged there. Like she had always been there. But the way she looked at me, that wasn't the gaze of a quiet, obedient caretaker. That was the gaze of someone playing a game. And I was about to lose. That night, after dinner, I wandered through the estate, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The mansion had always been unnerving. Too many locked doors, too many staff members who spoke in whispers. And then I found her. She was in the library, sitting on the edge of a velvet armchair, her bare legs crossed, a book in her hands. The firelight flickered against her skin, casting long shadows along the walls. She looked up when she saw me. She didn't seem surprised. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft. I hesitated. Something like that. She closed the book, tilting her head. "Your grandfather speaks highly of you." I almost laughed. "That's a first." She smirked. "Dangerous. Calculated. He's proud of you, you know. But I think he brought you here for a reason." I frowned. "And what reason is that?" She stood up slowly, stepping closer. Close enough that I could smell her. Something floral, intoxicating. Her eyes flicked to mine, a challenge. "I think he wants to see if he can resist temptation." I swallowed hard. "And you're the temptation?" She smiled. "Wouldn't you like to find out?" That should have been my warning. But when she reached up, her fingers trailing lightly against my arm, I didn't pull away. When she leaned in, her lips barely grazing my ear, I didn't stop her. And when she whispered, "Come find me when you're ready," before disappearing down the hall, I knew I was already in too deep. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. "I think he wants to see if you can resist temptation." I already knew the answer. I couldn't. And by the next evening, I didn't even try. The house was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. Grandpa had already gone to bed, and the staff moved like shadows, slipping in and out of rooms without a sound. But Elena? She wasn't a shadow. She was fire, and she was waiting for me. I found her standing on the balcony, overlooking the darkened estate grounds. The moonlight kissed her skin, the night air making the thin fabric of her dress cling to her body. She didn't turn when she heard me step outside. "I was wondering when you'd come," she murmured. My pulse pounded. "You knew I would?" She finally looked at me, her lips curling into that slow, dangerous smile. "Men like you always do." A warning, one I ignored. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. She didn't back away. She didn't hesitate. She let me want her. She let me fall. And then, just as my lips were about to touch hers, she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down my spine. Something about the way she said it, like she wasn't talking about us getting caught. Like she was talking about something else. Something worse. And then, a sound. The distinct, rhythmic tap of a cane against the marble floor below. My grandfather's cane. He was awake, and he was looking for something, or someone. Elena's fingers tightened around my wrist. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Go. Now. I didn't argue. I slipped back into the shadows, my heart pounding as I made my way down the hall, back toward my room. And as I shut the door behind me, pressing my back against the wood, trying to catch my breath, only one thought echoed in my mind. He knows. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak, every shift of the house. The sound of my grandfather's cane had faded, but the feeling it left behind didn't. He had been looking for something, or someone. I wasn't supposed to be with Elena, and now I was sure he knew. By morning, the air in the house felt different. The staff avoided my gaze. Conversation stopped when I walked into a room. Something had shifted overnight. Elena was nowhere to be seen. At breakfast, my grandfather sat at the long dining table, sipping his black coffee, acting like nothing was wrong. But I could feel it. The weight. The unspoken truth sitting between us. He finally looked up, his eyes sharp, unreadable. Did you sleep well? A test. I forced a casual shrug. Yeah. He smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Good. I'd hate to think something was keeping you up. The words sank into me like a hook. I gripped my coffee cup tighter. I was just restless. His smile didn't fade. That happens when you make mistakes. Silence. My throat went dry. I had spent my whole life trying to understand my grandfather, his power, his control over people. But sitting there, under his gaze, I realized something. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about an old man's pride. This was possession. And in his mind, Elena belonged to him. I spent the rest of the day looking for her. But every time I asked a staff member, they gave me the same response. She's busy. Busy with what? Avoiding me? Or avoiding him? It wasn't until late afternoon that I finally saw her. She was walking through the West Garden, moving quickly, her head down. I followed, catching up just as she slipped behind one of the old storage buildings. She flinched at my voice. Then, she turned, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. You need to leave. My stomach twisted. What are you talking about? She looked over her shoulder, lowering her voice. He knows. The staff told him. I clenched my jaw. So what? He's mad? He's not going to do anything. Her nails pressed harder. You don't understand. Her voice shook. He's done this before. The words hit me like ice. Before I could respond, I heard it. The distant tap of a cane against stone. Slow. Purposeful. Coming closer. Elena's grip tightened. Run. But I couldn't move. Because for the first time since I'd arrived at the estate, I realized I was in real danger. I didn't run. I should have. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, to turn around and get as far away from that house as possible. But I just stood there, frozen, my pulse thundering in my ears as the slow, steady tap of my grandfather's cane drew closer. Elena's fingers dug into my arm. Please, she whispered. If you stay, you won't leave this place alive. My throat was dry. You're overreacting. She shook her head violently. You don't know him like I do. And then she said something that made my blood turn to ice. The last man who tried to take something from him disappeared. I barely had time to process her words before the tapping stopped. A voice, his voice, cut through the heavy evening air. She stiffened beside me. I turned my head slowly. There he was, standing at the end of the stone path, leaning on his cane, his wrinkled face expressionless. But his eyes were alive with something dark, something I had never seen before. He wasn't just angry. He was hunting. No one spoke. The estate's garden stretched out around us, massive and empty, but suddenly it felt suffocating. Finally, my grandfather smiled. Calm, controlled, deadly. You've been very busy, haven't you? He said, tilting his head slightly. Elena's nails pressed into my skin, a silent plea. I swallowed hard. Grandpa, He raised his cane slightly, cutting me off. Tell me, boy, do you know what happens to thieves? My hands curled into fists. I'm not a thief. His smile widened. Then why are you standing next to something that doesn't belong to you? Elena made a strangled noise in the back of her throat. I took a step forward, putting myself slightly in front of her. She's not a possession. His grip on his cane tightened. Then why does she act like one? Silence. A shift in the air. Elena trembled beside me, but my grandfather, he didn't move. He was waiting for me to realize the truth. And that's when I saw them. The men, 2 of them, stepping out of the shadows of the estate. Large, dressed in black, moving toward us without a word. I turned to Elena. Her face was pale. She had known this was coming, and I had walked right into it. I grabbed her wrist. Run! She didn't hesitate. We bolted. The sound of footsteps exploded behind us, heavy and fast. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear them. The ground blurred beneath my feet as we sprinted through the garden, dodging past statues and stone walls, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. Ahead, the estate stretched into endless fields. No fences, no woods, just open land. If we could make it there, we had a chance. I tightened my grip on Elena's hand, pulling her faster. Behind us, my grandfather's voice rang out through the night, cold and amused. You thought you could take what's mine? A gunshot ripped through the air. Elena screamed. And for the first time in my life, I knew I was going to die. The gunshot shattered the night. I didn't know if he was aiming at us or if it was just a warning, but I wasn't about to slow down to find out. The bullet's echo still rang in my ears as I pulled Elena forward, our feet pounding against the damp earth, running toward the open fields beyond the estate. The men were still behind us. I could hear them. Heavy footsteps, muttered orders, the metallic click of a gun being reloaded. My grandfather wasn't just trying to scare us. He was trying to end this. Elena gasped beside me, her breath ragged, her grip on my hand tightening. We're not going to make it, she choked out. Yes, we were. We had to. I spotted an old tool shed up ahead, half hidden by overgrown vines. It wasn't much, but it was something, a chance to catch our breath, to come up with a plan. I yanked Elena toward it, nearly throwing her inside before slamming the wooden door shut behind us. The small space smelled like rust and rotting wood. I pressed my back against the door, listening. Footsteps. Close. A voice. One of the men. They ran this way. Another voice. My grandfather's. Calm. Steady. Find them. Elena's body trembled against mine. Her breathing was too loud, too fast. I pressed a finger to her lips, silently begging her to stay quiet. I could see it in her eyes. She was terrified, but behind that terror, something else lurked. Something that hadn't been there before. Regret. Like she knew something I didn't. Like she had finally realized what playing this game had cost her. Footsteps passed just outside the shed. Shadows stretched under the door. I held my breath. If they opened it, we were dead. Seconds felt like hours. Then, nothing here. One of the men muttered. Their footsteps faded. Elena let out a shaky breath, collapsing against me. I caught her, holding her up as she fought to stay upright. We can't stay, I whispered. She nodded, still shaking. There's a car, she murmured, behind the greenhouse. If we can get to it. Another gunshot. This one closer. No more time for talking. We burst out of the shed and ran. The estate stretched before us, its once beautiful landscape, now a maze of death. Every step we took, I expected another shot to ring out, expected a bullet to rip through me before I even saw it coming. The greenhouse loomed ahead. Beyond it, the staff's parking lot. And parked at the far end, a car. Our escape. I didn't question why it was there or if the keys were inside. I just ran. Elena was ahead of me now, moving faster than I thought possible. She reached the car first, yanking the door handle. It opened. The keys were inside. I barely made it to the passenger side before she threw it into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement. And then, through the rearview mirror, I saw him. My grandfather, standing under the estate's floodlights, gripping his cane, watching us go. His face was blank. expressionless. But his eyes burned with fury. Elena slammed her foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, kicking up gravel, tearing down the long driveway. I turned to her. Drive faster. She didn't need to be told twice. The estate disappeared behind us. We had escaped. Or at least, that's what I thought. Until I looked at Elena, really looked at her, and realized that she wasn't relieved. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying in relief or thanking me for saving her. Instead, she just stared straight ahead, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. And deep in my gut, a new kind of fear took root. Because in that moment, I finally understood. We had escaped him, but I still had no idea who she really was. Elena's grip on the steering wheel was tight, her knuckles white. The silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken words. My chest heaved, my pulse still racing from the escape, but something about her expression, the way she avoided looking at me, sent a different kind of chill through me. "Elena," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "What the hell just happened?" She didn't answer at first. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the winding road ahead. The estate was long behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't free. She swallowed hard. "You don't understand." I turned toward her, anger rising now, pushing past the fear. "Then help me understand. My grandfather just tried to have us killed, and you're acting like—" "He wasn't going to kill you," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You still here." "What?" She exhaled, shaking her head. "He was never going to kill you, but he was never going to let you leave either." The words settled in my mind like poison. I clenched my fists. "You knew this. You knew he wouldn't just let me walk away." Her jaw tensed. "I tried to warn you." I laughed, humorless. "Right? You told me to resist temptation. You never said my life was in danger." She turned to me then, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Because it wasn't. Not the way you think." The weight of her words pressed down on me. "Then explain it to me." She bit her lip, hesitating. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "I was never supposed to leave." The pieces started clicking together, but I didn't want to believe them. "What are you talking about?" She gripped the wheel tighter. "He owns people just like he owns that estate. And when he brings someone in, he doesn't let them go." I stared at her, the truth sinking in. "You were trapped there." A slow nod. "For years." My breath caught. "Why didn't you just run?" Her laughter was hollow. "Run where?" He has people everywhere. People who owe him, who are afraid of him. If I left alone, he would have found me. I leaned back, my mind spinning. "But you're not alone now." She finally looked at me, something shifting in her gaze. "That's why he's coming for us?" A shiver ran down my spine. I turned to glance at the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights, shadows, anything. The road was empty, but the dread in my gut wouldn't fade. "What do we do?" I asked. Elena pressed down on the gas, her lips set in a firm line. "We keep running." I exhaled, glancing out the window. The night stretched endlessly ahead of us, full of unknown dangers. But one thing was certain, we weren't free yet.